The idea behind a domestic vaccine passport's always been very tempting. You get the vaccine, you get proof of that, and then you'd be able to use that proof as a ticket into event venues, restaurants, stores, and people who aren't vaccinated wouldn't be able to get in. We have seen it done in other places, like Israel and New York. But in Canada, it's still a bit of an open question. Provincially, Manitoba's been giving out immunization cards to people who've been vaccinated. Quebec is handing out QR codes. But how they're going to be used is still unclear. Vaccination requirements have always been part of international travel. And on that front, the federal government's launched an app that lets international travelers upload proof that they've been vaccinated if they want to avoid quarantine. But we're talking about vaccine passports that could be required to move around your own city. As of Tuesday, almost 37% of the population's been fully vaccinated. Things haven't fully reopened, and there are those who want the privileges that would come with a hypothetical vaccine passport. And we've already seen some events like a Leafs playoffs game back in May requiring proof of vaccination. But there are those who've said from the beginning that this would be a bad idea, like my guest Cara Zwibel, director of the Fundamental Freedoms Program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association.
Normally, we don't have to sort of justify being out in public. We don't have to show that we have the right to be there. It's just a thing we have the right to do as people who live in a liberal democracy. This is sort of a move towards a show me your papers society.
Cara's on the show today to make the case against vaccine passports. Let's get into it. Hi, Cara.
Hi.
Thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So, Cara, we already have a system in place that lets people show proof of vaccination when they're entering the country so that they can skip quarantine. But what are some of the ways that you've heard people suggesting that vaccine passports could be used within Canada?
So, I mean, we've heard different things for quite a few months from, different levels of government, sometimes just tossing out ideas about, maybe this is something you'd need to show at a restaurant, maybe this if you want to go see a movie. But as far as what's actually happening in Canada, Manitoba is probably the province that's gone the furthest so far. So they've said that they'll be giving QR codes to people who are fully vaccinated, and that will allow people returning to the province from out of province not to have to self-isolate. Mm-hmm. And they've talked about other benefits sort of coming. So it's still a bit unclear and still developing. Quebec has also been issuing QR codes, but they haven't really said how they might be used or, what purpose they're supposed to serve. I do find it a bit strange, that we're sort of still talking about this, I guess, because, things are opening now and, the governments haven't put anything in place. I don't, for the most part, other than, Manitoba. And even in places like Manitoba, it's really not clear exactly what they're doing. They've said things like other benefits will come to people who are vaccinated, larger allowances for weddings and funerals. Mm-hmm. Especially in Manitoba, I think it's probably a lot about let's tell people there are benefits and that will encourage more people to be vaccinated. But I think the reality is the way that our public health systems across Canada have worked is that they've based their reopening plans on a look at the population as a whole. They haven't said, we're going to open for this segment and not open for this segment. We could have taken that approach right from the beginning, right? We could have said, look, if you're over 60, stay home. You're the ones that are most at risk, and everyone else go on and live your lives. But we didn't take that approach, and I think we understood that might be, a problematic approach to take. And similarly, I think it's a problem to do the reverse, to say, well, if you've been vaccinated, you get to do everything you want, and if you haven't, you'll have to stay home.
So we've seen vaccine passport programs rolled out in places like New York, which has its Excelsior Pass. How has that been working out so far there?
So it sounds like it's a bit of a mixed bag there. It's, some businesses are requiring people to show those passes. Some are not. It's still a bit of an honor system. So you sort of flash the pass, but they don't necessarily scan mm-hmm. it. In some sense, I think it's a bit more about this appearance of safety or this feeling of safety than, actually making sure that every person coming in has been vaccinated.
Right. So Israel is an interesting example. So Israel had this thing called the Green Pass, and a lot of people credit its internal use of the Green Pass system for its successful vaccine rollout. And, some people have pointed to that to say vaccine passports could be useful in incentivizing people to get the vaccine.
The reality is, I don't think we've seen data that suggests, first of all, that there is a lot of hesitation in Canada. We have a pretty high percentage of people who have already gotten their first dose, which suggests strongly that they will plan on getting their second dose and will plan on being fully vaccinated. The smaller percentage of people who have not yet been vaccinated, I think as far as, the justification that a vaccine passport system would incentivize people to be vaccinated, I just don't know that the case has been made in Canada that that's something that we actually need.
Mm-hmm. Civil liberties advocates like yourself have been pushing back against the development of vaccine passport programs. And what's your concern about having to show proof of vaccination in order to be able to go into certain places within the country?
There's a couple of concerns. One is that vaccination is supposed to be a personal choice that people make about their own bodies and their own health. And that autonomy that we all have over our healthcare decisions is something that we think is very important. And at a certain point, if you premise access to lots of places on someone being vaccinated, the vaccine ceases to be a choice and becomes, de facto mandatory because you can't participate in society without it. We also have concerns about equality and how this affects people who can't be vaccinated for health reasons, or people who won't be vaccinated, or people who are struggling with accessing the vaccine. And then finally, privacy. This is a personal health decision. And typically those are things that are not things that you have to share with a whole range of actors in society. And whether there are actually laws and rules in place that protect that kind of information from being disclosed or used in other ways, those are all questions we have about how this would work.
Mm-hmm. And what is the fear exactly when it comes to privacy? What kinds of surveillance could we be subjected to?
So I guess part of it is if we think about a society where, everywhere you go in public, you have to show this pass. That really does create a sort of network where your comings and goings can be monitored and tracked. Now, it would require a lot of integration of systems to do that. And I'm not saying that's necessarily where this would go, but it's still, authorizing a range of actors, from the person who takes a reservation for you at a restaurant to the person who takes your ticket at a movie theater to a clerk at a grocery store, to have this personal health information. And if you think about people, for example, who maybe can't be vaccinated, who might need an exception or an exemption, sharing the personal information about why they can't be vaccinated may be something that's quite a lot more intrusive than just, vaccinated or not. And regardless, I think, we do have to recognize that providing this kind of information to people is a fundamental shift in the way our society works. Normally we don't have to sort of justify being out in public. We don't have to show that we have the right to be there. It's just a thing we have the right to do as people who live in a liberal democracy. This is sort of a move towards a show me your papers society where, you have to prove that you are what society deems safe in order to be out in public.
Mm-hmm. Is it actually legal for businesses to refuse service to people who haven't been vaccinated? Could this not be considered a form of discrimination?
It could be. I think it would depend on, it might depend on the reason for not being vaccinated. So certainly someone who has a health care issue that prevents them from being vaccinated would, I think, have a pretty strong argument that was a physical disability or, which is protected under our human rights codes across Canada. So I think there might be a strong argument there. Whether someone who has religious or conscientious objections could benefit from, laws that prevent discrimination on the basis of religion or creed, I think that's a little bit of a harder question to answer, but I certainly think there's an argument there as well. So I do think, what those laws generally say is that if you're going to refuse service on that basis, you would need to provide some kind of accommodation. So it can't just be if you've not been vaccinated, you can't come in. You might have to figure out, special times of day when people could come, or maybe, you'd have to do some sort of curbside option or something like that. But I worry about, what that looks like and how ostracized we would make people who have not been vaccinated. And I think there's, to the extent that this is something we want to do in order to encourage people to be vaccinated, I think there's actually a possibility of it backfiring badly, and people, who feel excluded saying, well, this is just not something I want to have anything to do with anymore. So it wouldn't really help in that way. It would just sort of entrench them in their position.
But businesses have been doing that with masks. So how is that different from requiring people to be vaccinated?
I think it's partly different because it's something that, you can visually just see, right? You don't have to ask for any sort of proof to know that whether someone's wearing a mask or not. I do think we've also seen with masks, most of the mandates for masks across Canada do have some exceptions and say, some people can't or won't be able to wear masks, and exceptions should be made for those people. And in many cases, the rules also say you shouldn't be asking people for proof of those, exemptions. But in real life, I think that's not what's happened. I think for, many businesses have just said, if you can't wear a mask for whatever reason, you're just not coming in. And I think that's a problem. We've heard some really sad stories about, families with children who are on the autism spectrum who have a really hard time with masks. And, stores have just said, you just can't come in. And, again, I think there's been a bit of this idea that having, one unmasked person or one unvaccinated person is such a danger that, we have to do everything. We have to create this whole infrastructure to prevent that from happening. I think that's just not true. The way that I protect myself from the virus is by making the decision to be vaccinated. And, it might mean that when I'm with people who I don't know and I don't know their status, I'm going to be more careful than when I'm with people that I do know or that I know have been vaccinated. But, that's the trade-off of living in a society that values people's individual choice and their liberty.
I imagine also that there are concerns around authenticity, right? Like I've heard reports in the US of vaccine passports being offered on eBay and being sold on like the dark web.
Yeah, for sure. I think even, the Excelsior Pass in New York, there's been some issues with that being relatively easy to sort of hack or falsify. You have people also posting photos of themselves with their proof of vaccine, which has, their date of birth and when they got the vaccine and what kind of dose they got. So there's a lot of information that's being shared. And there are concerns about authenticity, but, those concerns only sort of rise to the top if we actually go down this road, which again, I really don't think we should.
So there are settings where we have to show proof of vaccination, like schools, for example. Children have to prove that they've been vaccinated in order to be able to attend school in some places. And so what's the difference between that and being required to show proof of vaccination to enter a business or go to work, for example, from your point of view?
So, the big difference is that, with a school setting, you're talking about first of all, an institution that's got a connection to the government, and that's collecting information about a student that they're going to have an ongoing relationship with, and that they're going to be collecting lots of information about that student, right? They're going to be creating records and report cards and things like that, and they have obligations to keep that information. They have privacy obligations, they have human rights obligations. That's very different than the restaurant or the grocery store that you may go to briefly, or that, you run into even a supermarket or a pharmacy or something outside of your neighborhood once, and this record is created.
There are recent polls that say that there is widespread support for vaccine passports, and there are business owners who really support having them. Like I was reading in Manitoba, people who work in the travel and in the entertainment industries there are people who are very excited about this because it's going to help. They think that it's going to help people feel safe coming into their businesses. And so I guess they would ask, if we don't have vaccine passports, how do we know that people around us are vaccinated and feel safe? And how do we reassure people who are coming into these businesses that they can feel safe? And what would you say to that?
I guess, a couple of things. I mean, I think that the pandemic has kind of shown that people have, right, there's a wide spectrum when it comes to people's sort of tolerance for risk. And I think there are some people who are, even with a vaccine passport system, are going to be very reluctant to be out in public with strangers. They're just going to be nervous about that, regardless of the safeguards. And you have some people who, couldn't care less. And even at the height of the pandemic, we're saying, let's open things up and be out and about. So I think there's a big range. Ultimately, I think the only way that if you're concerned for your own safety, I mean, that's why you get vaccinated. Being vaccinated is not a 100% guarantee that you won't become infected. It does obviously substantially reduce the risk of serious illness and death. And the evidence seems to be that it also likely reduces the risk of transmission. But you just, unfortunately, as much as it might make you feel more comfortable, you just don't have the right to necessarily have that information about other people or to force them to do something that they're not comfortable doing, with their bodies. And we are going to, I think, get to a point where enough people have been vaccinated that, lots of things can open, and it won't, even if people do get sick, we won't be in a situation where our healthcare system is being overwhelmed. But COVID is unfortunately another reality that we're going to have to live with and sort of incorporate into our lives. And we have to recognize that there is a risk of it, even if we have been vaccinated. But creating this radical change in our society where, some people don't get to participate because they haven't made, what we decide is a socially acceptable decision about their medical care, it's just not where we should be going as a society.
So given all of the concerns that you've just laid out, why do you think we're still talking about this, and why is there this attraction to the idea of vaccine passports?
I mean, I think people are, desperate for some sort of return to normal life. And throughout the pandemic, we've had different things that have looked like sort of that silver bullet that's going to get us there. So, I remember when the contact tracing app, right? If everyone downloaded the contact tracing app, we would nip this thing in the bud. And, and then it was masks, as long as if everyone is wearing masks, when we're out, we're going to be able to resume a normal life, just wearing a mask for a while. It turns out that's not the case either. And so now I think it's the vaccine, which is obviously a different type of solution. And it is, a hugely important one in terms of protecting your own individual health and safety. But this idea that, I need to know that everyone else has been vaccinated and then the pandemic will go away. I mean, the pandemic might go away, but the virus is not going away. And, the scientists have said that this is not going away anytime soon. This is likely to become sort of endemic. It won't be the huge loss of life and the huge numbers of seriously ill people that we've seen, but COVID will continue to exist. And even if you've been vaccinated, you might still get it. So we're never going to get that risk to zero. So people have to, I think, figure out the appropriate sort of risk mitigation strategies that they are comfortable with. But I don't think it justifies this radical change to our society where, I have to prove that I've made this decision that you think will benefit you.
Great. Cara, thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
And that's it for today. And just before I let you go, a quick news update on a story we covered a couple of weeks ago: the search for Canada's next Governor General. On Tuesday morning, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced that Mary Simon has been appointed to the role. She's going to be the first Indigenous person to serve as the Queen's representative in Canada. If you want to learn more about her, you can read the Globe's coverage at theglobeandmail.com. If you want to learn more about what the Governor General does, check out our episode from June 16th. You can find it in our feed. I'm Tamara Kendacker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Cara Zwibel from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. You can find their work at ccla.org. If you want to email us, we're at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at anima_TK. If you haven't followed us, wherever you're listening, do that so you don't miss any episodes. And if you haven't already and you like this episode, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.